So we begin. So the goals of this lesson, we're going to start with talking about array lists. So we talked before about arrays. We talked about objects and classes. And so now we're going to move on to array lists, which is going to be a very useful tool and object and class that we'll be able to use to our advantage. It's similar to an array, but it's also much better, as we will see why. So we will learn the differences between the two, arrays and array lists. We're going to learn how to use an array and what situations to use array lists. And you guys are going to tell me what situations we're going to use array lists versus arrays. So we'll do a little bit of thinking as well. So some key terms, we have an array list, position, index, size, dynamically grow, and dynamically shrink. Of course, not all of these are going to make sense, and you're not going to understand them until the end of the lesson. So as we progress, as we continue, make sure to keep these in mind, and we will revisit them at the end of the lesson to, inshallah, review and understand every single one of them. Okay. So what is an array list? Let's start with an array. I'm sure everyone remembers what an array is. So this constructor here, private int data, and int has brackets, equals a new int 5. What this does, and I'm sure you all can tell me, is it creates a new array which stores integers with a size of 5. So it has 5 total elements. And remember that an element is a something in that array or array list. So this array data will forever have only 5 integers. It's a fixed size. We cannot change the size of the array once we constructed it. That is going to stay permanent. And integers can store basically any data type. It can store a string. It can store doubles. It can store Boolean variables. Whatever you want, it can store. And we've seen this. We've seen Boolean arrays. We've seen other stuff. And we've seen arrays with strings in it. And an array list. So let's talk about array lists. This is how you construct an array list. Don't worry about it yet. I will cover it. But this is just how it looks. So we have array list in brackets, but it's the greater than or less than signs. So integer, data equals new array list integer. Once again, don't worry about that. We'll cover it later. I just put it here so you can see the difference between the two. So the array list data can change in length, right? So if I want to, we talked about how the array can only stay at 5 total integers, but the array list can be up to as many integers or as little integers as you want. And that is depending on whether or not the programmer wants to add or subtract. And array lists store objects or classes. And we will talk about them. We'll talk about this later, what this means. But this is just a brief overview. So the main takeaway here is array lists can change in size and store objects, versus the array will have to stay that length forever and can only store mostly the primitive data types and maybe some classes. Everyone good with that? Makes sense? Perfect. Thank you, Walid, for the thumbs up. Okay. So let's talk about adding an element to a position. So let's say we have this array list right here. So it goes 11, 99, 0, 5, blah, blah, blah. So this is our array list. This is how we're going to envision array lists from now on. It's basically blocks in a line, okay? So here, we want to add 55 to index 3. So we want to add the number 55 to the third index. Now remember back to arrays that indexes start with 0 and they work their way up. But positions start with 1 and work their way up. But when we're accessing the element, we use the index. Remember, so if I say the 0th element or the 0th index, this would be 11. If I say the 9th index, I would be looking at 10. Okay, everyone good with that? It can get a little bit tricky sometimes with index versus position, but index is what Java looks at. Okay, good. So let's say we want to add the number 55 to the index 3. So what happens is the Java takes that third index, it slides everything over, and it places 55 in the third index. So we have a visual here. We have our array list existing here. Chops it off at 3, slides it over, and puts in 55. My best analogy for this is, let's say you have a deck of cards, a stack of cards, and let's say you want to put a card in the middle. You choose a part at the middle, you slide it over, you put the card in, and you put it back together. And now you just put a card in the middle of the deck. Does that make sense? So like I said, if we look at back here, oh, Bashar, thank you for the thumbs up. Why can't I? There we go. Okay. So as we said back here, array lists can change in length. So this length just went from 10 total elements to 11 total elements. See here, we have 0 through 9. And now once we added it, it's 0 through 10. So the array list stays the same, except for we add 55 to the third index, and everything else gets an index of what? Can anyone answer that for me? So if I put 50, let's say 5 is now the third index. What index does it become next? Bashar with current index plus 1. Exactly. So 5 becomes the fourth index. 23 was the sixth index, became the seventh index. So does that make sense to everyone? We slide it over, and because there's an element before it, it changes to current index plus 1. So now, what about everything before the third index? What is the index of all these beginning numbers? Does it change or does it stay the same? It's the same. Thank you, Walid and Bashar, and Bakr. Perfect. So you guys understand. Awesome. Perfect. So that is the main difference. That is a big functionality of array lists that we will now we will take advantage of. So I visualize this a little bit better here. So here we have the old length of the array list is 9, right? Because well, length is actually 10, but there's 9 indexes, so we'll say 9 indexes. And the new is 11 positions, but 10 indexes. Okay, so these are in terms of indexes. Keep that in mind. But this is a little bit different than length, but we'll talk about that later. So the old order of an array list, like we see here, is going to be 11, 99, 0, blah, blah, blah. And the new order is going to be 11, 99, 0, and then 5. So we place that, or sorry, 55. So we place that 55 in there, as we see here. So I think everyone understands this. And so I guess we'll move on to removing. Okay. So removing an element, we used to have 9 indexes, but let's say I want to take 23 and I want to remove that. Okay. So what happens is here we have 23, which is the 6th index. Okay. So the 6th index, and we want to take it out. So what we can do is Java will go through, okay, 0, 1, 2, 3. Oh, here's the 6th element. It'll pick it up and it'll just throw it away. And everything else after that slides down. So as we saw before, if you put something in, everyone slides up. But if you take something away, everything slides down. So in this case, we take away 23, which was the 6th index, and then everything slides down. So what happens to the index of everything after 23? What is the new index? So let's say, what's the index of 1 after this change? Current index minus 1, yes. So I see everyone's saying 7. Perfect. So we take the 1, and because 23 is now out, it slides down to 8 minus 1, which is 7. Perfect. MashaAllah. Everyone's understanding this, I think. So perfect. That is exactly what we want to see. So we see everything shift down. Now keep in mind, I can remove any element I want. I'm not choosing these specifically. I can take out 23. I can take out 99. I can take out 11. It doesn't matter. And the same principle will apply for every element. If I take out 11, that means everything shifts down and everything gets a current index -1. If I take out 5, everything after this will get current index -1, but everything before it stays the same, like we looked at when we added the element. Remember, we added it and everything before stays the same. So that's the same idea that applies. Okay, so I believe everyone, for the most part, understood what was going on with the changing of sizes and adding elements. So now we'll move on to constructing it. I was going to put constructing at the very beginning, but before we started with constructing and the syntax, I wanted to make sure everyone understood the conceptual understanding and what's going on in the background of an array list. Okay, so can I see a thumbs up from everyone if they understood an array list, how it changes, the indexing? Okay, perfect. So I see some thumbs up. Okay, so let's continue. ArrayList Constructor. So I showed you guys a little bit of a constructor before at the very first slide. We see ArrayList integer equals, or data equals new ArrayList integer. So as you guys remember from strings, from constructing a string, we have string and then the name equals, and then you have the string name. Here, because ArrayList is a class, we have ArrayList. Now in these greater than and less than signs, I'm just gonna call them, I'll probably call them triangle brackets for now, but that's just what I'm gonna call them. Some people might have a different name. So inside the triangle brackets, we have the data type, and then we have the name equals new ArrayList, and then the same data type. Okay, so that's important, the same data type. Now, do you remember before when we were comparing arrays to array lists and we said arrays can store primitive data types and some classes while array lists only store objects. Now this is going to be important. It's a little bit tricky, but this data type here in yellow is replaced with a string or an integer or another wrapper class. So before, if we were constructing an int and just any integer, we'd have int and then the name, right? Just int. But here, we require it to have integer, spelled with a capital I and the full word. Now, we'd call this the wrapper class for an integer. So I put up a little chart here where we see, byte goes to capital B byte, boolean goes to capital B boolean, char goes to capital C character, etc. So when you go to construct your own array lists, you can reference this, and you'll get the hang of it soon enough. But it's a little bit confusing sometimes to go from using primitive data types to using the wrapper class. But that's just how array lists work. And you can, if you want to know why, I think I linked some extra reading below at the end of the slides that'll help you understand why wrapper classes exist and why array lists use them. But for now, you're just going to have to trust me and use that wrapper class instead of the primitive type. Sounds good? So if I were to construct an integer array list called numbers, the way I would do that is I do array list integer in the triangle brackets space the name, which I called numbers, equals new array list integer. And keep in mind that creates an array list that starts out empty. So it has zero, it has nothing inside of it. Okay, sounds good. So I'll cover the wrapper class again just briefly. We have to use that wrapper class version of the primitive data type. So let's say you want to create an array list of Boolean, okay, of Boolean variables that can remember that's either 0 or 1. Instead of typing ArrayList with a primitive data type, which is Boolean with a lowercase b, you take the let's say you say boolean, you go to the chart and you look across and you see boolean with a capital B. So instead of using that primitive data type, you replace that with the capital B. That's how you'll do it when you start out. And then as you continue, you'll be able to, you'll memorize it. You'll understand which ones are wrapper classes or primitive data types. But when you're starting out, it's okay to always go back and say, okay, I want to use a character. So you look at char and then you go to character, if that makes sense. Rumesa, thank you. So they're called angle brackets. I'll call them angle brackets. Okay. So if I want to construct that same array list of integers, I will not do it by this. If you look at the bottommost thing, it's ArrayList and in angle brackets int. That's not how you would do it because ArrayList will not understand that. The way you have to do it is integer, spelled out with a capital I. So if I wanted to create an array list of doubles, what is the wrapper class for the primitive data type double? Can I see it in chat? Good. So I'm seeing everyone type double with a capital D. Perfect. What about char, like char? So if I have char as the primitive data type, what do I type out as the wrapper class in the array list? Character. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, great. It seems like you guys understand. So I guess we'll move on. Oh. Yeah, okay, so adding elements here. So assume we have the array lists, and a lot of my examples here are going to be using this same array list. It's called integer. It's using the wrapper class integers. Okay, so they're integer numbers. And it has a length of 5, and it has 4 indexes, 4 total indexes. So it goes 0 through 4. And the way I will add it is I'll say number add 13. Numbers dot add 13. This is the syntax for adding an element to an array list, but this is specifically adding the number 13 to the end of the array list. So what this is doing is it's taking that array list and then it's adding, it has 13 and it adds it on to the very end. Okay, does that make sense? So instead of adding it into the beginning or the middle and being confusing, it just stacks it on top. So an analogy going back to the deck of cards, if I have a deck of cards, I'm just adding a number, I'm just adding one card onto the top. And so that's the topmost card. And this does not change the index of anything else because it's just adding it to the very end. So that 13 just becomes the n plus 1th index. So before we had a max index of 4. So the new index of 13 just becomes 5. I hope that makes sense for everyone. And so what happens, now you may ask, what happens if I want to add the number 13 or any other number into the middle? So now we get into a little bit of different syntax. So the way it works is, let's say you want to add 13 to the second index. So that would be the third position, okay? You do numbers.add, which was the same as before. We had numbers.add, but this time you pass 2 numbers. You pass 2, which is the index, and 13, which is the value. So now we're passing 13 to the second index. And what's that doing is, like we saw here, when we added 55 to the third index, it slides everything else down. Okay, everyone makes sense? Can I see some thumbs up? It's a little bit confusing, but hopefully you guys understand because of what we did before. Okay, here we are. So yeah. So the way you do it, like we saw before, our original array list was 5, 10, 2, 6, 8. But now it becomes 5, 10, 13, and then 2, 6, 8 because of what we did to it, because of we added the 13 to the second index. Perfect. And just to recap, so the syntax for adding two options is you have the name, dot add and the value for adding it onto the end, or you have the name dot add the index and then comma the value. So there's two different ways of adding something to an array list, which makes it, you have some manipulation. So if you are constructing an array list for the first time, remember when you construct an array list, it becomes empty. So you will probably use the first name.add and just the value for building up the array the first time. But if you want to go back and change something, you can go back and add, let's say, add something in the middle or add it at the beginning. So that, if that makes sense, there's a difference, and you will use one versus the other in certain circumstances. Okay, so now let's say we want to change an element. Let's say I don't like that 6. I want to change it to a 7 because of the data. Let's say I inputted the data incorrectly, and instead of constructing it again, I just want to change it. So what we'll do is we take the index. So the index of 6 is what? What's the index of 6 in this array list? Perfect. So I'm seeing some 3. That's correct. So the index of 6 is 3. So what we do is we do numbers, which is the name, dot set, and then the index, and then the value. Like we saw before, we saw numbers dot add index comma value. The index goes first, and then the value goes second. So here we change that third index to the value 7. So it looks like this now. It went 5, 10, 2, 6. Now it goes 5, 10, 2, 7. So the syntax for this is, this will move. Come on. Okay, name, remember the name of it, dot set, the index, comma, the value. And you'll see a lot that I type out the name in brackets, but don't include the brackets when you're typing out the name. That's just for showing you put the name. So like, see, there's numbers without brackets. I just wanted to clarify that in case anyone got confused. Before I continue, are we good on that? Any questions on anything before? If you have any questions, make sure to put it in chat so I can read it and we can go over it. Everyone good? I see some thumbs up. Perfect. And remember, if you have a question, there's a likely chance that someone else has the same question. So please speak up. Don't be shy. Okay. So now we're removing an index, or removing an element. This at the bottom should be a V, but that's a small error. Okay. So let's say, once again, we have the same array list of numbers, 5, 10, 2, 6, 8, with their indexes below. So once again, if I want to remove, let's say I constructed this array list and I added everything, but now I don't need that number 10. I don't need that anymore. So I'll say numbers, name of the array, dot remove, and then in parentheses, 1, which is the index. So the Java will then go and take that first index and just throw it out of there. And like we talked about before, it'll slide all of these down 1. So their indexes are the current ones minus 1. As we saw before, we talked about when you add an element, it adds 1. And when you subtract an element, it subtracts 1 from them. So use that understanding and apply it here. So we are now taking away that first element. And now it becomes 5, 2, 7, 8 because of that 10 is missing. And the length changed from 4 total indexes to 3 total indexes. And the syntax, once again, is name dot, and it should be remove with a V instead of a T, but I'll change that later. So it's name dot remove, and then the index. So now if we want to get an element, let's say I want to read out the element there. So what happens is, assume we have array list numbers. So this takes this array list, and it gets anything. Actually, forget about this for a second. This is just a mistake. This should not be here. Focus on the first, what's it called? The first of the green boxes. So it'll get the 0th element. So I have a question here. If I do numbers.get0 and I print that, what will it return? Can anyone guess or tell me? Bakar Walid. Perfect. So I see 5. Awesome. So if I return that and I print that out, I'll get 5 because it's the 0th index. So the syntax here is the name dot get and then the index. So now, let's say we want to iterate. Okay, so iteration, we talked a little bit before with our for loops. Okay, so let's say we once again have the same array list. We have the 5, 10, 2, 6, 8 with their indexes. And let's say we want to just index through it and we want to go through every single integer and let's say print them out. If I have this for integer, remember we have our data type, num : numbers. So this gets a little bit confusing. It's not like the normal for loop where you have the for and then you have I equals 0, I less than something, I plus plus. It's not the same as that. This is going through, it's like a each loop. So for each, you're looking at for each integer number, or for each integer num in the ArrayList numbers, okay? So it's looping through every single element of this ArrayList simply by typing integer num : numbers. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes seeing different syntax for different for loops. But if I were to run this code for integer num going through the ArrayList numbers, and I print out num, what will this return? I know it's system, it's printing the line, but what happens if this was just printing it out without the line? Perfect. 5, 10, 2, 6, 8. Yeah, Bashar typed it with the line. I mean, that's what it would be. But Walid, also, you're correct. Perfect. Okay, so you guys understand. It's looping through the array list, and it's printing them out. And hopefully, you guys will be able to do this later. Like, let's say you want to get the total sum of this array list. Let's say you want to add up all the numbers. Then you can just run a for each loop through the array list and sum them up. Or let's say you want to multiply them all. You do the same thing. So hopefully you guys will be able to utilize that for something in the future because that is a very useful loop. Everyone good there? A little bit confusing, but hopefully everyone understands. Perfect. I see some thumbs up. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay. So now we'll talk about the size of the array list. So here, once again, the same array list. Let's assume that we constructed it using integers, and we have this is the name numbers. Once again, numbers dot size. Now this is one of the less important ones. Like it's more important to know how to add and remove, but nonetheless, getting the size of an array list is pretty useful. For each loop is useful when you don't need. Yes, okay, so Ramesa put something actually useful in chat. So the for each loop is useful when you do not need to use the index to change an element. So actually keep that in mind when using the for each loop in the future. Anyways, so if I print out numbers dot size, what will that return? If I just print it out. It is the same for dot length for arrays. Perfect. Exactly. Actually, you answered it better. So it's the same as the dot length for an array. So if I were to print out that numbers dot size, I'd get 5. Now here, you may be asking, oh, I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the size would return 4, right? But actually, it's a little bit tricky because these are indexes, right? That's not actually the length. So yeah, so Ra'a said 4, which is what most people would think. But Bashar answered, no, the size starts counting with 1. Bashar is right here in the sense that when you're counting the length and the size of it, you're looking at the number of elements. So if I were, let's say I have a bunch of books in front of me, okay? Let's say I have 5 books in front of me. I'm not going to start counting with 0, right? I'm not going to call the first book 0. I'm going to call the first book 1, right? So if you were to start counting the books with 0, then you would have 4 books, right? That's what this is here. It starts with 0. But when we count something, we don't start with 0, we start with 1. So the indexes starts with 0. There are 4, it goes up to 4 indexes, yes, but there are 5 total elements. So the size returns 5. Does that make sense, Ra? If you're confused, I can repeat it and I can go over it again. Yes? Okay. I just want to make sure that this is, because this can be tricky because we see 4, but it's not actually 4 total elements. Okay? Everyone good there? Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So now I guess we'll work on exercises. I think I'll give you maybe 15, 20 minutes just so we're able to kind of clear up everything. Yeah, we got some time, and then hopefully we'll be able to share, and when everyone's done, each person will be able to share their work. So hopefully we'll get one problem 1 and problem 2. But yeah, so we'll give me 20 minutes. So inshallah, what is that? Is it 6:55 for you guys? So 6:55, we'll come back, and go over the answers, and you guys will share. And once again, if you have any questions while going over them, feel free to ask.
Good. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can
Can
see
you
it.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
The first question asked us to make an array list with a string. I call it array1, new array list string, and I added some random strings so I can work on. And then I try to figure out system.out.println array.get for the index 0. So we can see the replacing after that. Wait. And I create a for loop, normal for loop, not for each. Starting with k, so I can now know where the even indexes are. Is that right?
It's close. So you had the correct idea. But what you want to do is, okay, so let's see your code. We have a for
I,
loop.
I thought you want us to remove the indexes, the even indexes, right?
Ah,
Zero.
okay. So you're right. If the way at least I saw the question, or when we wrote it, was remove the strings that have a length that's even. Does that make sense?
Oh
So
yeah.
like
Yeah. I got it.
um
Have I
oh
to edit
okay.
it right now?
Okay. Okay. So what you actually want to do is you want to get the length of the string from the array list, right? Ah, there you go. MashaAllah. There you go. Okay, so if that's perfect.
Now,
Okay, so does everyone get
right?
yeah, that was perfect. MashaAllah. So everyone get what Bashar just did? Okay, Bashar, can you explain that one more time?
Okay, basically I get the elements from the index k. So I will see every element, all the elements, starting with 0. So the element of 0 is high. The length is 1, 2. So it is even. So basically I will remove it. Array1 dot remove array.1 dot get k. The same k the condition was true for. The second one, HELLO, it's five characters. So it will not be removed. So if we, okay, wait, we can run it to see. Okay, here was high, but we removed it because the length is even, and we replaced it with hello, right? Am I right?
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
And another one, pi, will be removed, and the last index. So we can now see how it will be removed and replacing with the next one that is not even, low by, see?
There is one thing that you may run into in the future.
If I created it for each, it would be easier, but I didn't get it from the first time. So
No, I
for
mean
loop,
for each loop,
normal.
yeah, for each loop would have been better. I mean, it's still fine to use a for loop, but there is one tricky thing about using a for loop here, and that is when you remove that k value, right? You remember that the array list is changing, right?
Right.
So you
Yeah.
sometimes you may have to say when you remove it, you go back to k minus 1. Does that make sense?
Yes, because it will change. Maybe something will change the index of.
Exactly.
So we
So
have to
sometimes,
repeat from the start, like
not
this.
from the start, but you'd have to go back. So like k minus, yeah, yep, perfect. Oh no, k minus minus. Oh, you can just, what is it? You can just do k minus minus, and it'll be subtract 1. Um, but yeah, so that way you go back to the previous one. So it's a little bit tricky. So
Yeah, I
for
got
each
it.
loop may have been better, but it makes sense, right? Does that make sense to everyone? Bashar, that makes sense to you? Perfect. Everyone good with that? Okay, perfect. So thank you, Bashar, for sharing the first one. Does anyone want to share the second? And if no one wants to share the second one, Bashar, you can also share your second one. We'll give it maybe a couple seconds. Don't be shy. If you think you got it, go ahead. Okay, Bashar, you can go ahead and share the second one. We'll see what you did here.
Okay, thank you. So here, okay, it's not matter. Okay, a new array list that is integer with capital I, numbers, I called it numbers, and I added the same integers that in the exercise, so we can see the difference. It is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the same indexes of the exercise question. And I said that there is an integer, which is the main one, and by randomly, I want it to be the numbers that get 0, the first one. So I just give it a value from the same array I can work on. So for integer, I use the for each here, as you can see, for integer num in numbers. If the num we are on is less than the num we decided to be the main one, then remove it and add it at the first of the array. Is that clear? And break. So, and print it to see the results. So at first, the 2 was the -1, was in the index of like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I replaced it to be in the index of 0. Is that right? Or you want it to be sorted like
No,
2, 3, 4?
you're right. That was perfect. MashaAllah. Well done. That was a tricky one too. So Alhamdulillah, I was glad that you got it. Does that make sense to everyone? Did Bashar did a great job of explaining it, but does that make sense? We just want to make sure, so everyone understands it. Everyone good there? So he basically compared the first one to every number. Um, the only thing is, the only issue sometimes in the future with this problem is, let's say the first number um, is, let's say it's 10. That if statement will sometimes say, that, let's say you have any number less than 10. In this case, 2 was the only number less than 3 because 3 was the first number. So if you have, let's say 5, then you have multiple numbers that are less than that, and you may run into some trouble. But I think that's a good this is a good starting solution. And it gets more complicated, but this is still great. He's using properties of ArrayList as well, so it works out. But keep in mind, sometimes this may not always work. But thank you again, Bashar, for explaining. Okay, so we'll just continue and finish this up. So some key terms, I'll give everyone maybe 30 seconds to just think about them, and then we'll go over them. All right. So array list, there's no exact definition for an array list, but I just defined it as just a resizable array because they function a very similar way. But as we saw, array lists are much better since they can dynamically change based on whatever, and you can add and subtract. So that's how I defined it. And a position, so you start with 1, and it's whichever element is. So as Bashar in his example, in his array list, he showed the indexes, but when he returned the size, it showed the last position. Okay, does that make sense? So yeah, so if I have, we'll go back to an example here. So this, it's going to be 5 positions. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the 5th position. This is the 1st position. An index starts with 0. So instead of starting with 1 like positions do, it starts with 0. But indexes is more important to Java because that is what the program uses, because it starts with the index. It starts with 0 as the index. So size is just how many elements. Like the example before of counting books, you don't start counting with 0, you start counting with 1. So the last index is 1 less than the length, if you think about it. So once again, I'll go back to the example here. The last index is 4, but the length is 5. So that sometimes can be a nice trick to remember. And then we also have dynamically grow, so it grows with added elements, and dynamically shrink, so it shrinks with added elements. And these are just some key terms. So I think the dynamically grow and shrink are pretty important because that is a key attribute of what makes an array list instead of an array. Any questions on this? Nope, all good. Okay. Homework. I just like the homework. Actually, can you guys still see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll cover it briefly, but you're just there's one mandatory problem and one optional problem because we'll be covering some other stuff in this lesson. But keep in mind that if you ever need help at all on this, number 1, ask your mentors, and number 2, go back to this presentation because it has a lot of useful information. And if you need some more help, you can do some extra readings. A lot of them may have some answers that you might need. And there's also a little bit of a tricky thing here. It talks about triangular numbers. If you don't know what a triangular number is, that's fine. And I linked a quick website down here that shows what a triangular number is. And once again, if you are still confused, ask your mentor. They will be more than happy to help. But this is a pretty tricky problem. So if you don't finish, that's completely okay. Do not worry. You can always get some help. So yeah. Inshallah, those will go well. Extra readings and any questions, go ahead and ask. So I'll leave about 15 seconds for questions. If you guys have any, just listen out for them. Type them in chat if you need to as well. Okay. I think I'm just going to close it up now. So begin with Bismillah. I'll end with Alhamdulillah. Thank you guys again for listening and paying attention and participating. And now we'll move on to Sister Ramesa is going to be teaching about Git. And so I'll let her introduce that topic.